Hi guys, it's Dr. Silva, and today I'm going to talk to you about Trintellix, vortioxetine. I want to start off by saying this episode is billed as Trintellix being a superior antidepressant. And of course, I just want to say right off the bat, you can't say that any given medication is going to be better than other medications for any specific individual. Obviously, it's a case-by-case basis, and one can never say that. But I will tell you that in my experience, Trintellix has been a game changer. The first generation of antidepressants were the monoamine oxidase inhibitors and the tricyclic agents. And then when I was a medical student, the SSRIs had been developed, Prozac and Zoloft and Paxil. By the time I was a resident in the mid-90s, we had Paxil, we had Luvox, Celexa and Lexapro were on the horizon. It was my first year of residency when venlafaxine was released. And venlafaxine was unique because it combined the selective serotonin reuptake inhibition mechanism with serotonin norepinephrine reuptake inhibition. It was an SNRI. And even though the reuptake of norepinephrine wasn't anything new because the tricyclics, most of the tricyclics were noradrenergic, even though you had imipramine and clomipramine, which had significant serotonin reuptake inhibition properties. And so basically there you have two SNRIs right there. They belonged to the tricyclic class, which were also antihistaminergic and anticholinergic and had a variety of side effects. They were not clean medications, and they could be fatal in overdose. And so these newer generations of medications, including the new SNRI, venlafaxine, Effexor, were much safer. They were better tolerated, and yet we were combining these two mechanisms of action. And then eventually duloxetine was developed, Cymbalta, also an SNRI. When we think about improving upon a regimen, because we have no response or only a partial response, the patient isn't getting better, and we have to do something different. We have to change the medication. We're still thinking about the target symptoms. We're still thinking about the neurotransmitters that we want to augment, and that hasn't changed. And so we really aren't going to go far afield. We're not going to go from Prozac to Wellbutrin. That doesn't make any sense. But what we would want to do, if we want to stick with monotherapy, if we want to stick with just one medication, keep it simple, is to increase that neurotransmitter using a novel mechanism. If reuptake inhibition is failing, then maybe we want to think about a medication that increases serotonin by a different mechanism, or a medication that combines serotonin reuptake inhibition with a novel mechanism. And so that's why we typically don't shift from one medication to another within the same class of medications. So if one SSRI isn't working, then we typically don't switch from one SSRI to another SSRI. We would do that because of tolerability. We would do that because the patient isn't tolerating the side effects of Paxil, and so, well, maybe Lexapro will be better tolerated, but we want to stick with an SSRI. If a medication isn't working, then we would switch from an SSRI, say for example, to an SNRI. Either that or add a medication if we want to go ahead and use an augmentation strategy if the patient is getting some response to the SSRI, but not enough. But I have to tell you that when I had a patient who was on a certain kind of medication, a certain class of medication, and I was getting a lackluster response, a sluggish response, or no response, then moving to a new medication, to the latest SSRI or the latest SNRI, it was kind of more of the same. And even with Vibrid, that added partial agonism at the serotonin 1A receptor, even that, which does boost a little bit the antidepressant and anti-anxiety actions of an SSRI, really, we already had buspirone. We could already add buspirone, and adding buspirone never really impressed me anyway. What Vibrid was good for, I felt, was decreasing the incidence of sexual dysfunction because of that partial agonism at the serotonin 1A receptor. So I wasn't very impressed with the new medication. So, okay, another SSRI. All right, we already have 5. Okay, here's another one. And another SNRI. Big deal. It's just maybe it's going to be different in terms of the side effect profile, but there's no reason to believe that it's going to be different in terms of efficacy. And if a medication, one of the newer generation, better tolerated, safer medications like an SSRI or an SNRI weren't working, then my first thought would be, let's think about using a tricyclic agent. Better yet, let's think about using a monoamine oxidase inhibitor. I would actually go backwards cohorts and think about using the earlier generations of antidepressants, because there was a lot of evidence to show that they were more efficacious. They were so-called dirty drugs in that they hit a lot of receptors, and so they had a lot more side effects, and we don't necessarily want an antihistamine, and we don't necessarily want something that's going to dry your mouth and give you constipation and blurred vision and make you dizzy. But those medications work better in a lot of patients, and so that would be my thought, not reaching for the latest SSRI, the new one on the market. But when Trintellix came along, it was really a game changer because it's really a unique medication. It's not just another SSRI. It does have that mechanism of action. It does have selective serotonin reuptake inhibition. I would say it has serotonin reuptake inhibition. It's not so selective because it does a lot of other things with the serotonin receptors. And in fact, it's called a multimodal, a serotonin multimodal agent, because it does increase serotonin, but it actually increases all of the monoamine neurotransmitters, serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine, as well as glutamate, which is the major excitatory neurotransmitter in the central nervous system, and acetylcholine and histamine. And that has some implications in terms of the efficacy of this medication and what target symptoms it improves. It also reduces gamma aminobutyric acid, which is the major inhibitory neurotransmitter in the central nervous system, by 3 different mechanisms. And so, wow, that's a lot more than just increasing serotonin by blocking the reuptake of serotonin. So this is a little esoteric, but just for the sake of being complete. So it's an SSRI, a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. It's also a full agonist at the serotonin 1A receptor subtype. And similar to buspirone or Vibrid, those are partial agonists at that receptor. They stimulate the receptor, but not as much as serotonin would, whereas Trintellix stimulates that receptor, but it does so just as much as serotonin would. It's a full agonist at that receptor. And the implication there is that there's less sexual dysfunction, just as with buspirone and Vibrid, but all the more so. Actually, it decreases sexual dysfunction when you're talking about anorgasmia, but stimulating that receptor is actually not good for erectile dysfunction. So it actually inhibits the penile erection, but it promotes the orgasm. So you might see some ED with Trintellix, but you're less likely to see sexual dysfunction otherwise. It is also a partial agonist at the serotonin 1B receptor subtype. We've never seen that before. And an antagonist at the serotonin 1D and 7 receptor subtypes. There are 7 classes of serotonin receptors, and each class has numerous subtypes. And finally, it's a 5-HT3, 5-hydroxytryptophan, that's a precursor to serotonin, a serotonin 3 antagonist, like mirtazapine, Remeron, which is an antidepressant, as well as, for that matter, ondansetron, Zofran, which is an antiemetic medication. And so, like those 2 medications, Trintellix has antiemetic properties, and so the nausea that you see with the SSRIs, you see far less of it with Trintellix. I'm not saying it's not possible to experience nausea. If you dose it too high, too fast at the beginning, you certainly can get nausea, but the nausea that you get from its own serotonin reuptake inhibitory properties, the increasing serotonin that way, is offset by the 5-HT3 blockade. And so if you start low and you take it with food and you dose it slowly and properly, you really shouldn't see nausea. That can be said about the SSRIs as well. If you dose properly, you can really mitigate nausea. You can minimize it or obviate it entirely. But definitely with Trintellix, you should not be experiencing any nausea. If it's dosed right, it's got a built-in antiemetic. So here you have a medication that's already sounding good, right? First of all, it's multimodal. It increases all of these neurotransmitters, but it's also got less nausea and less sexual dysfunction, except for erectile dysfunction maybe, than the other medications. That's very significant. This is not a medication like the ones that we've had. This is new. So I would switch patients sometimes within the same class, or I would switch from an SSRI to an SNRI. But even making that switch in a patient that was mostly well, you wouldn't really see a whole lot of improvement. Nothing that got my notice. But when I would switch patients with endogenous major depression, mind you, okay, so these are patients that have a genetic aberration, there's a chemical problem, the problem is chemical, they're not just reacting to a situation, it's not just an adjustment disorder, it's not that someone died or they lost their job or they're getting divorced, it's that there's something wrong with their brain, there's something wrong with the central nervous system, they need medication, they're going to get a robust response to medication because it is a physical illness. Those patients, when I would switch them to Trintellix, and I mean switch, so we're coming completely off of this SSRI or this SNRI or this combination of an SRI and Wellbutrin, and we're going to switch to Trintellix, they would come back into my office the very next visit, which would probably be anywhere from 2 to 4 weeks later. They would come back and I could tell that they were better when they walked through the door. I could tell from their affect, from their smile, from the spring in their step, for their psychomotor activity, these objective signs, even from the waiting area sometimes, I could see that they were better if I opened the door and invited them in from the waiting area. They would get up and they'd smile at me and they'd walk back to my office, and the improvement was night and day. There was no doubt that they had gotten significantly better. And it was because we had changed that medication. And I was impressed. As a matter of fact, I had 2 patients with bipolar disorder who were experiencing a depressive episode who were on mood stabilizers, mind you. And I flipped them into hypomania. They came into my office and they were hypomanic. They were euphoric. They weren't euthymic, they were euphoric. They came in and we had to back down. I don't remember what I did, whether I just increased their mood stabilizer or probably what I did, or we lowered the dosage of the Trintellix because I actually made 2 patients manic. And so this is a medication that I knew right away, the one to reach for if we were getting a lackluster response or no response. Rather than going backwards and pulling a medication from the earlier generations that were dirty, it had a lot of side effects, it could be toxic and overdose, I was going to use that Trintellix. I want to say, I don't want to give the impression that Trintellix is a medication that you have to worry about inducing mania. Okay, this was 2 patients out of hundreds that I had with bipolar disorder that I gave that medication to. It's not like giving a stimulant. It's not like you're expecting mania and you're calling for it. I just give those examples because they're very colorful examples. They stand out to me as if there were any doubt before, and having patients that I could tell they were better just from the spring in their step and the smile on their face when they came back to greet me compared to the last time I saw them, even ones that weren't all that depressed to begin with, then that certainly cemented in my mind that this is a very strong medication that works really well. Because like Vibrid before it, we had a medication that's going to have less sexual dysfunction, but it's going to work better, and it's going to also have the added benefit of causing less queasiness if it's dosed properly. So Trintellix was a game changer, and actually it was called Brintellix when it was released. This is interesting. In May of 2016, the FDA approved a brand name change. The FDA has to approve the change of a name of a medication. It was still brand name only, and the FDA had to approve a name change because those are the rules. It must have cost millions of dollars. I mean, they already had an army of drug reps out there with all the materials and the samples and the sample boxes with all the labeling, and they had to change it all. And of course, it took a while for the transition. I had Brintellix samples in my sample closet for quite a while, even after the change was effected. But so Brintellix became Trintellix. And this is because there was another medication on the market, Brilinta, which was an antiplatelet medication, a blood thinning medication that was given to cardiology patients to prevent strokes and heart attacks. And there was confusion. There were prescribing errors and dispensing errors. A doctor would write for Brilinta, this life-saving cardiology medication, and they'd get Brintellix, which was a great antidepressant, but they needed a blood thinner, not an antidepressant. Nothing else changed. Vortioxetine is the generic name. It's FDA approved for the treatment of major depressive disorder, but it's used a lot, and clinicians think to use it when you've got a depression that has a lot of cognitive symptoms, because there is some evidence that it's better for patients with cognitive symptoms. And so it's also been used a lot in patients with Alzheimer's disease, the elderly who tolerate it very well, who also could benefit from a little cognitive boosting. It doesn't treat dementia by any means, but the reason that it improves cognition, for one thing, it's pro-histaminergic, so the opposite of an antihistamine. It increases histamine. We have learned that histamine is one of the quote-unquote smart neurotransmitters. That increasing histamine, like increasing dopamine and norepinephrine, improves cognition. Pro-histaminergic medications are known to be nootropic. New from the Greek word for mind, and tropic meaning to change or to turn, so literally mind changing. And this also includes the medications Provigil and Nuvigil, modafinil and R-modafinil, which they're stimulant medications that are not the typical amphetamine or methylphenidate preparations, but ultimately they increase dopamine and norepinephrine as well. They are stimulant medications, but they also make people smarter. They allow a person to tap into their maximum cognitive capacity because they increase histamine. The antagonism at the serotonin 7 receptor is also thought to mediate these pro-cognitive benefits. So Trintellix is a great medication. It's got a lot of pluses. In addition to being probably more efficacious for most people, not all, but most people, it's also well tolerated. It can be taken with or without food. You shouldn't crush or divide or chew the tablets. It's formulated in a certain way to be taken whole, but it's got less nausea and less sexual dysfunction than the other agents, and it can improve cognition, and it's all around a good medication. It's definitely a welcome addition to the armamentarium, and it has spurred a lot of interest in that serotonin 7 class of receptors, the 5-HT7 group of receptors, specifically because of the cognitive benefits that we can get from it. The only downside is the cost. Even if you have insurance, it's likely to be your top tier, your more expensive medication. And a lot of times you have to get prior authorization from the insurance company. You have to show that you have failed other medications before the insurance company will pay for it, simply because it's more expensive, and they can do that. Insurance companies can do that. So that's unfortunate, because there's no reason not to reach for it as a first-line agent. The problem is cost. If the insurance company is not going to pay for it until you try some other things, you might never get to it, because there are other medications that might work all right, but you still would do better on Trintellix. And so I think that clinicians should have a very low threshold for considering a switch in a patient that is, you don't want to switch a patient that is doing a whole lot better. But if they're just doing kind of a little bit better, or even significantly better, but then you have these side effects, particularly sexual dysfunction, you might have a patient with some sexual dysfunction who's significantly better on another medication. But I think that if you have any other reason to switch, like a chronic side effect that is borderline deal breaker, then physicians should have a fairly low threshold for trying Trintellix if they were unable to reach for it as a first-line agent because of cost considerations, because of the greed of insurance companies, basically, to put it very bluntly. It's a shame. I think that requiring prior authorization for medications and arbitrarily saying that they're not going to pay for it if cheaper medications that are also FDA approved for that disorder aren't tried first is the corporate practice of medicine. That's just my lowly opinion. Legally, it is not considered, because they are able to legally do that, but don't get me started on insurance companies.